French Mirage 2005 fighters will appear in Ukraine in the near future, before the end of the first quarter of this year. This was stated by the head of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noel Barrot, on air at Sud Radio. Soon, French Mirages will be flying over Ukraine, he noted. According to Barro, the planes will appear in Ukraine by the end of the first quarter, as stated by French President Emmanuel Macron. In early June 2024, Emmanuel Macron announced his intention to transfer Mirage 2000 fighters to Ukraine. According to preliminary data, France is to transfer 6 fighters in the first batch. In late December, it became known that Ukrainian pilots had completed training on Mirage 2000-5F fighters. Earlier, the media reported that the first 3 French Dassault Mirage 2000-5 fighters should arrive in Ukraine by the end of April. It was noted that they will be equipped with the best French air-to-ground weapons, in particular SCALP-EG cruise missiles and Hammer glider bombs. In early January, it was reported that Ukraine was to receive the first 3 French Mirage 2000-5F fighters by January 20, 2025. However, some sources indicated that the aircraft were already in Ukraine, although they were only performing training flights so far.
After the start of the all-out war against Ukraine in 2022, Russia's economy exceeded expectations. While the results are far from stellar, they are not catastrophic. CNN reports. Last year, the Russian wartime economy likely grew faster than the economies of the US and key European nations. Unemployment hit a record low, and the increase in defense spending, though temporarily squeezing other areas, did not spiral out of control. Elena Rybakova, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, notes that these figures send a dual message to the Russian public. We're still standing. To Ukraine's allies, we can outlast you. We can outlast you. However, experts caution that this image of economic resilience is an illusion. The Kremlin carefully maintains the facade of a stable economy to influence its adversaries. As the war approaches its 3rd anniversary, this mask is beginning to slip. Some analysts describe the situation as an economy on steroids. While the growth may appear rapid, it is artificial and unsustainable. Steroids is a good one, but it still produces some muscle. I wouldn't call this muscle, it's more like running around on cocaine, said Rybakova. The Kremlin also employs a strategy of reflexive control to shape the adversary's perceptions. For instance, Moscow has tried to convince the West that its economic strength can fund the war for years, nudging Ukraine's allies toward compromises that align with Kremlin goals. Alexandra Prokopenko, a fellow at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center, argues that economic growth and low unemployment have become key points in Putin's rhetoric. However, the reality is far less optimistic. Craig Kennedy, an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, says the Kremlin hides the true cost of the war through shadow financing mechanisms. His research reveals that the government compelled banks to issue subsidized loans to companies linked to military contracts. From mid-2022 to the end of 2024, private lending grew by 71%, equivalent to 19.4% of Russia's GDP. Around 60% of these loans, up to $249 billion, supported military enterprises. This scheme risks triggering a financial crisis as a wave of toxic debt accumulates, potentially collapsing the banking system when war-related companies begin defaulting. Even without a credit crisis, Russia faces significant economic challenges. The IMF forecasts GDP growth to slow to 1.4% in 2025, following a 3.8% rise in 2024. Inflation has already reached 9.5% in 2024, up from 7.4% in 2023. Some supermarkets have even locked basic goods in cabinets to combat rising theft. Labor market issues are also creating strain. Despite a low unemployment rate, 2.3%, a shortage of skilled workers is forcing companies to raise wages, adding to inflationary pressures. Prokopenko warns that Moscow cannot continue funding both the war and the regular economy while maintaining broader economic stability. A new video has emerged showing a crisis in the Russian occupation army, with the Russians having to handcuff their own soldiers to force them to storm the area. The servicemen of the Russian armed forces who refused to die in the so-called meat assaults were forcibly chained to each other by their commanders. Thus, the soldiers had to go to the starting point of the offensive. One of the occupiers filmed this trip. "We're going to the combat mission in handcuffs," he said. It is obvious that the chances of survival for fighters who are forcibly sent to storm are minimal. The Russian armed forces are suffering very heavy losses in the war against Ukraine. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, in less than 3 years of aggression, the Russians have already lost about 830,000 soldiers, missing in action and wounded. It should be noted that the Russian army is actively encouraging conscripts aged 18 and older to sign contracts to participate in combat operations due to losses and a decrease in the number of contract volunteers as their age category grows. Andriy Kovalenko, head of the National Security and Defense Council's Center for Countering Disinformation, said that due to the decline in the number of contract volunteers and the growth of their age category, as well as losses, the Russian army is now actively encouraging conscripts over 18 to sign contracts with further deployment to the combat zone. In fact, commanders are faced with the task of ensuring the transition of young conscripts to a contract, Kovalenko wrote. According to the head of the center, they are thrown into combat in the first weeks after signing the contract, but they are not warned about such a quick participation in combat, only promised money. Russian mothers should think about how their psychologically young offspring are patching up the holes at the front in the so-called SVO, Kovalenko said. The defenseless soldiers often make up the first wave in Putin's meat assaults, heading up the advance so the fitter troops behind them can identify the threats ahead. Throughout the war, the Ukrainian army has reported capturing scores of Russians who are already suffering from serious injuries sustained in previous attacks.